Rose Grove, right behind you is Brook Avenue. Up until about 1975, this was probably one of the most remote areas of the park. Hardly anybody ever came here. I remember coming here as a young teenager, wide-eyed and bushy-tailed, and roaming the park and coming up and finding these monuments and being so impressed by them. The 53rd Pennsylvania, 2nd Delaware, 64th New York, 27th Connecticut, and behind me, 145th Pennsylvania, which came primarily from the Pittsburgh area. And I don't know what it was that struck me about this brigade, the 4th Brigade, 1st Division of the 2nd Corps, except there was something about it that just hit a note with me. And that was the same time that Bill Frasnito's book, Gettysburg, A Journey in Time, came out, and Bill's research here had found those photographs Alexander Gardner and his crew took on or about July 6th or 7th in that field behind you of the dead Confederates lined up for burial. The story that goes on here, that happened here, those what you see in those images, and I think you've all seen them, of the lines of dead Confederates lined up, laying there, bodies bloated in the sun, unrecognizable, is a result of the fight between Brooke and Paul Semmes' brigade. This handsome young man, John Rutter Brooke, 23 years old at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. He was only a colonel, but he had commanded a brigade twice in combat. And here at Gettysburg, he is in command of the brigade, 4th Brigade of the 1st Division. As Brooke said earlier, came through the wheat field, stopped in the wheat field, fired a volley or two, kept at him, advanced, drove that one line back into the second line, up this declivity, and then drove these Confederates back across that wheat field. And here's where Brooke made his stand. The problem with this, it's so far out from the rest of the Union line. There's a huge gap of about 200 yards between here and the Irish Brigade. Even though he's trying to extend his right down this hill and get some help from some of Zook's regiments to extend that line, they can only hold very briefly because, again, most of Kershaw's men are now gathered around the Rose Farm buildings, the spring area, firing back, keeping these men pinned down and keeping that gap open all the way to the wheat field. So he's up here really on his own. He sends word back to his division commander asking for help. And this, once again, comes from his report. I'll pass this around. Take a look at him. Brooke was born in Montgomery County in 1838, and he began the war as a captain in the 4th Pennsylvania Infantry, which was one of these 3-month regiments. After that was over, he helped raise the 53rd Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, where the monument is right over there. One of the most impressive monuments, I think, in the park because of the statue on top, the soldier overcoat, things like that. That statue, unfortunately, is not unique to that monument. You could buy it in the catalog. But they put the monument up and put the soldier on top. It represents a lot, I think, about that unit because it represented all parts of the Commonwealth. There was a company almost from every part of the Commonwealth in that regiment. And Brooke led that regiment very well at the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862. It was noted by some of the reports in the aftermath that the dead closest to the wall at the base of Marie Heights belonged to the 116th Pennsylvania and the 53rd Pennsylvania. Brooke obviously survived that, went to the Battle of Chancellorsville, and here at Gettysburg, now his brigade has come right down the slot through the wheat field, driven these Confederates back to this point. Where the monuments are today is not really where these regiments were. They were actually behind this cliff we just came up. So they are firing now almost at ground level. Anything that comes across that field behind you cannot escape the fire. The problem is, Brooke writes, in 1885, he's answering a letter, I found our line halted and fighting about halfway across the wheat field. My line covered nearly the width of the field when we advanced. Driving the enemy out of the woods south of the wheat field, we halted on the edge of the wood fronting the Rose Farm buildings. The open country was now in our front. I do not know what troops we drove out, so the firing was not heavy at this point as we reached the cliff. I sent messages back to General Caldwell asking for more troops to be sent, either that or ammunition, because my troops now, taking this place, had an average of 5 rounds left per man. They fired almost their entire cartridge boxes getting across the wheat field and driving the Confederates out. They're up with 5 rounds per man average, and now Semmes Brigade, Paul Semmes Georgia Brigade, about 1,800 officers and men have reformed to the other side of that wheat field, and they advance en masse here towards the woods. Brooks' men rise up, fire a volley, and it's devastating. See this account from Major Peter McGlashan, who was in the 50th Georgia that day, in his post right behind the regiment. Said a dense and large mass of infantry suddenly arose, poured into destructive fire of musketry, driving the front line or a large portion of it in confusion against the second line. We rushed against the enemy for what seemed to me an hour. The hottest and sternest struggle of the war was waged at the edge of the woods, right where we're standing. It was a regular melee, the opposing ranks mingling and fighting hand to hand with bayonet and clubbed musket. This frenzy of fighting lasted only about 5 to 10 minutes. To him it seemed an hour. As Brooke later reports, I found my flanks threatened by a strong force of the enemy. I held my ground, both my aides being wounded and myself severely bruised. With great difficulty I was able to maintain a proper knowledge of the movements of the enemy, being notified about this time that a heavy column of the enemy were coming upon my left. This is part of Anderson's brigade and actually part of Benning's brigade, which I know some of you are going on Matt Atkinson's program this afternoon, are now advancing against Brooks' left to drive him out of here. I held him at bay for some time when word was brought to my right was also being turned, and finding no troops coming to my support, and finding that unless I retired all would be killed or captured, I reluctantly gave the order to retire, and in good order the whole command came off the field slowly and firing as they retired. Passing back over the wheat field, I found the enemy had nearly closed in my rear. Had the movement not been executed at the time it was, I am convinced that all would have been lost by death, wounds, or capture. And it's remarkable to me that Brooke kind of echoes the sentiment of St. Clair Mulholland and many others that they retired in good order when actually the chaos they reached when they got into the wheat field is where they received almost all of their casualties because of this torrent of Confederates then hitting them from 3 directions and driving them out. That's where most of their casualties were taken. And in 1889, when veterans of the 53rd Pennsylvania came back to dedicate their monument, they had a photograph taken of a small group of veterans that were members of the and survivors of the Battle of Gettysburg. They have it photographed up here. It's photographed down the wheat field, where they suffered the heaviest casualties. On the other side of that was General Paul Semmes, Confederate commander of the brigade, who had been wounded severely in the beginning of the action. I'd like to have Eva come up here and tell a little bit about General Semmes.
So General Paul Semmes is born June 4th, 1815 in Wilkes County, Georgia. He attended the University of Virginia and was a plantation owner and businessman in Columbus, Georgia before his Civil War service. He is wounded here at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 2nd. He will then write a letter to his wife on July 9th. My dearest wife, I telegraphed you today to say seriously wounded, main danger over, stay at home, will write. I was wounded on the 2nd at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I arrived here in an ambulance yesterday, a distance of 60 miles. He assures her that he will write again soon and that the wound has done remarkably well, though I have traveled part of 4 days in an ambulance which was very uncomfortable. Not leaving the ambulance, after being placed in at the hospital until I got here, I now write flat of my back in a comfortable room in a private family who treat me well. He was wounded in the leg and says that he stopped the flow of blood in the field by a tourniquet that he applied himself and was drawn away by one of his men. He said he lost but little blood. He also says to her, my brigade suffered severely and behaved well. Much love to all, your affectionate husband, Paul J. Semmes. God will fully spare my life. We all have cause to be thankful to him. He wrote that letter in Martinsburg, Virginia, on July 9th. He dies 1 day later, July 10th, of infection and hemorrhaging. His wife Emily, hopefully comforted by these words written by men who were with Paul when he died. A few moments before the general died, he asked for his sword. Laying it across his arm, he asked again for his testament. He took it, and with it in his hands expired. They would have left it so, but that he asked that you should have it. Oh, if all our warriors might die as he did, death would be robbed of half its sting.
Thank you, Eva. Awesome. story of General Sims, I think, kind of sums up what happened here. That all the hopes and wishes of these men that meet their fate here on the Rose Farm in Gettysburg makes it some of the bloodiest ground on the battlefield of Gettysburg. Those photographs we talked about earlier, and most of you, I know you've seen them if you've looked at a book on Gettysburg or seen the movies, TV, Ken Burns series. Those images of the dead Confederates in battle line or in lines of dead out here in this field. I don't think we really need to go over that again. We know where they were. The problem I've always felt in looking at these photographs is this morbid fascination we have with where those bodies were laying, and not the story of the men, who they are. Their names are gone forever. And that's because their comrades did not have time to bury the bodies, did not have time to mark the bodies properly, had to leave them there to the fate of whoever came along next. And unfortunately, that would be John Rose. As John Rose returned to his farm on July 6th, July 7th, and found dead, unburied all over the place, then he had the task of trying to recover his losses and take care of all these dead. And as late as July 8th, he was complaining to a visitor that there were dead still unburied laying up there in those woods in that field, right up there. The field owned by Francis Ogden and cultivated by John Rose. Though we don't know the names of these individuals, we know who they were. They're regiments from Semmes Brigade, part of the 15th South Carolina, dragged into groups, and I really theorize that they're small groups instead of just one large trench grave. They're small groups because the men who did that knew who they were. They knew each man that they were dragging out of these woods across that field into line. So they grouped them together by companies or by regiments. So anybody could be marked. It was all from the same regiment, 10th Georgia, 51st Georgia, 50th Georgia, or is all from the same company, Company I, Company C, Company K. And what validates that theory is where we're going to go to next at the Rose Barn. Though we don't know the names of those individuals out there, we do know the names of others that were photographed by the Rose Barn, and that's where we're going to go next. My best suggestion for you is you can go down the lane here, backtrack to the field with the way we came through the gates. I'll meet you at the Rose Barn at the bank on the other side. Okay? I want to stop here at the Rose Barn and be our last stop of what remains of the Rose Barn because of its significance. When I first came here in 1980, at least the south gable of the barn and part of the north gable were still standing, and today it's merely a ruin, which is falling more and more into nothing. Soon it'll be just a pile of rock. And I lamented back in 1982 and 1983, a great preservation job here would be rebuilding this barn, not just for the structure itself, but because of the significance of it. It sheltered the wounded of Kershaw's brigade and Semmes Brigade both on July 2nd throughout July 3rd. Hundreds of wounded took shelter in this barn where they were triaged by assistant surgeons and surgeons, and throughout the night of July 2nd into the morning of July 3rd, ambulance upon ambulance came down that lane behind you and took the wounded out of here until about July 5th, or July 4th, late on July 4th, when the last of them, except for a handful, were taken out. The result of the combat here and all the fighting naturally is the dead. What do you do with the dead? Like I said earlier, you're familiar with the photographs taken up in Rose Grove of those dead Georgians and South Carolinians, photographed by Gardner probably on or about July 6, 1863. There's another photograph which I know is also just as famous or maybe quite infamous, is this particular image here of the open grave. This photo was taken right here at this spot. And I'm going to get to this in just a second because I've got this photo and another I want to briefly discuss. But in the aftermath of this, John Rose comes back, and he's not a very happy man. You can only imagine why. His farm has been destroyed. The house has been ransacked. There's blood all over the floor. The barn is empty. There's blood all over the floor in there. There are bodies in the barn. There are bodies out here. Bodies everywhere. And what happened in that aftermath that morning of July 3rd was Kershaw's men gathered all their dead to bury them. There were not enough tools to do so. So as they progressed throughout the morning, burying dead here and there, it didn't get to anybody. It was that afternoon. The cannonade opens. pickets charge. They are under fire. They can't go anywhere, but then about 4 o'clock they're ordered to pull out, and they have to leave these unburied comrades behind. They've not been able to take care of them. The bodies are left to the mercy of the farmer and eventually the cameraman who will come by and take photos here on July 6th of the Confederate dead. Some of the visitors to the farm, J. Howard Wirt, some of you may recognize that name. He was a former soldier, visited the battlefield, wrote quite a bit about the battlefield in the aftermath, was here a few days afterwards, just observing things. And he did say that no one farm on all the widely extended battlefield probably drank as much blood as did the Rose Farm. And I agree with that. Because of the casualty counts, there were a total of approximately 9,000 Confederates engaged on this battleground right here on the Rose Farm itself, of which around 3,200 were casualties. Union, around 13,000 Union soldiers fought on the Rose Farm property, of which around 4,000 were casualties. The total dead, anywhere between 400 and 609 killed on this property. And when they were killed here, they're buried here. Word continued that the enemy constructed defenses in the timber and used the house and barn and adjoining fields for hospitals. The burial of the dead and that of 240 Union dead were buried upon it and subsequently removed. Between 1,000 and 1,200 rebel dead fell and still lie upon it in trenches and scattered graves all over the farm. And he wrote that about 1869 or so, much later, and no, there were not 1,200 Confederates buried here. That's really an exaggeration, I think, of one of the early maps, the Elliott map, because they just couldn't count all the graves in the woods and throughout the fields. But Rose himself, they never did financially recover from this. And he tried to sell the farm in 1866. They filed claims for damages, and some of his description of the damage and the losses here financially and physically are pretty heart-rending. But it sums up like this: the destruction of crops and fences, injury to the buildings and land were very great. Nearly all the fences were thrown down, at least 1,000 panels of worm fence, and of these at least 500 panels burned and or destroyed, of which he later commented, "I never received any compensation for the whole or portion of this claim." He didn't receive a dime of it.
Can you turn on your speaker a little bit, John?
Turn it down?
Just a little, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Is that better? Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. Just catching a little interference.
What?
Yeah.
Will you please be quiet? Another visitor, John Lynn, who was came down from Carlisle, I believe it was on the battlefield very soon after, wrote a pretty detailed account of sites he visited. One of these was the Rose Farm. Everybody hear me okay now? All right. And he wrote, "Here to the north of this barn, we counted 33 graves of the 12th South Carolina Volunteers. They were slightly covered with earth, and you could feel the body by pressing the earth with your foot. One man's left hand, J.B. Robbins of Company I, 8th South Carolina Infantry, stuck out of the grave looking like an old, parched, well-worn buckskin glove." Not getting this. Not getting the other better. Okay.
Right.
A little further on across the fence was the grave of John J.W. Weldon of the 53rd Georgia, and near him was that of Captain J.M. DeBond of the 53rd Georgia. In his garden, that's the one we just passed through, those double gates behind the house, Mr. Rose told us were buried 10 superior officers, colonels, majors. That morning he had removed them for fear of injury to the water of his well to a ravine in the woods 1/2 mile to the east of the house. We placed their headboards beside them and left them unburied, not having the strength or means to bury them. He pointed up to his wheat field and said there were over 50 rebels were lying there still unburied. And the wheat field he was pointing to is Rose Grove. Those photographs taken by Alexander Gardner on July 6th. The names that Lynn rolls off, let's not forget these were human beings with families far, far away back home, and they were all dead. It was 8th South Carolina, buried right here on the hillside behind you, and was now a wheat field. John Robbins, Company I, was the Marion Guards. He enlisted in 1861, was a corporal and a farmer before the war, and here he met his end at the Rose Farm. All he had left was recovered with $87 in Confederate money, and that was sent home to his attorney, family attorney. J.W. Weldon of 53rd Georgia was a resident of Coweta County, Georgia, enlisted in 1862. He was buried between two apple trees, which stood right over here in the orchard. His body was also taken home, and he is in Savannah, Georgia today, in Laurel Hill Cemetery. Captain John Mitchell Dooley DeBond, Jr., the Jeff Davis Rifleman, Company I, 53rd Georgia Infantry, resided in Butts County, Georgia, left his wife Charity A. Goddard behind with 4 children. He was buried in the back of the privy, which is right over there on the other side of the barn. His body was also taken home to Savannah, Georgia. Of the 10 bodies or more that Rose removed from the garden and were taken to what they call the gravel walk, he eventually went down and buried them, but he was ordered by the provost marshal to stop digging these bodies up and moving them. It wasn't his responsibility, and there was also a health hazard that was going to be initiated. They didn't know whether he was actually moving Union, Confederate, dead. He just didn't really know. One of the dead that was buried here by his comrades was Lieutenant Colonel Francis Kersey of the 50th Georgia Infantry. That day he was killed on July 2nd. That night his comrades, the men who knew him, wrapped him in a blanket and buried him on the trail that goes down to the Rose Spring house. Grave was well marked. Body was there for several years. And eventually John Rose's one daughter went mad. Every time she had to go down to the spring house and pass by Kersey's grave, she envisioned him coming out of the grave to get her. John W.C. O'Neill, who was a local physician and well known for keeping a journal of where all the Confederate graves were on the battlefield, was eventually came out here to see her and ordered a straitjacket. That's the only thing that was going to save her. So there was a nightmare that continued with the Rose family for years and years after the battle. One of the most touching stories here too was also the story of Lieutenant Colonel James Washington Hance of the 53rd Georgia. He was a native of Lawrence County, South Carolina, attended South Carolina College, well educated, wound up as being Lieutenant Colonel of the 53rd Georgia. He began the war as a captain, was colonel by the time of Gettysburg, was mortally wounded and died here, was buried by his men on July 3rd, in a well-marked grave. J. Howard Wirt noticed that it was his grave that was about a yard or so from the kitchen door. So it's right behind the house, the back of the house where Colonel Hance was buried. He was one that Rose was not able to remove, evidently, until 1871. And just a couple days ago, I came across some letters written to Dr. O'Neill. These came right after the war, 1865 to 1872, of Southern families looking for their dead fathers, their dead sons buried here on the battlefield, and none of them on the Rose Farm, and one of those was Lieutenant Colonel Hance. The letter that came to O'Neill in September 1871 was written by Thomas B. Cruz, who was in charge of a Lawrence, South Carolina newspaper, and Cruz confessed that he was the son-in-law of Colonel Hance's. He was basically the son-in-law of Colonel Hance's parents. I should just shut up and read the letter. The bulk of the letter is this. He's the son-in-law of Mr. William Hance, the colonel's father. He writes, "As you have shown so much interest in these unfortunate parents, I will remark that at the outbreak of the unhappy war, they enjoyed the society of 4 lovely children, 3 sons and 1 daughter. 1 son fell at Gettysburg, 1 at Fredericksburg, 1 at Chickamauga, the latter a youth of just a few years. The 4th, my wife, died in 1867, the last and only child left in the ravages of war. Yet they bear their afflictions with true Christian resignation and fortitude. Colonel Hance left a widow and 4 small children behind." Dr. O'Neill personally paid for the transport of the remains to South Carolina, and to be sure that they were the remains of her son, Mrs. Hance ordered that the box be opened, because she remembered that the colonel had 1 bad tooth and 1 missing tooth from his lower jaw. Opened the box, examined the jaw. Sure enough, 1 tooth was missing, another was a bad tooth, and she was rest assured that that was her son's remains and could remain at home. And as they said, all doubt was gratefully removed. Last 2 photos I want to discuss here are these 2. The most famous one that we all know of the open grave, members of the 2nd South Carolina Infantry. This open grave was photographed by Alexander Gardner on July 6th, right there where the truck is. So our maintenance guys timed that just perfect, didn't they? So close, he went to examine this, will recognize that from the claims file, Mr. Rose filed a claim for the loss of floorboarding. Boards made specifically for floors. The grave markers are made from those floorboards. But who are these men? That's the important thing. Who are they? I got to give a shout out to Mr. Scott Fink. Scott's out here in the audience. Very shy, Scott. Scott and I have been trading emails and messages on Facebook for about 2 years maybe. And Scott has done a lot of research into who these individuals were. But I have to also give credit to others as well. Greg Coco, who was a longtime ranger historian here, did a lot of research on the burials here at the Rose Farm, the identified burials of the Confederate dead. And he was one of the first to write extensively about who these men were, their names and IDs. But I got to hand to Scott, because Scott has gone far and above anybody I know to research the backgrounds of these men, where they're buried today, and the results of their burials here. I'm going to pass this around. Let you look at it. The 4 bodies up in there are 3 that can be identified. Lieutenant Picken Butler Langford, who was in Company E of the 3rd South Carolina. He was from the Newberry district of South Carolina, basically Newberry, South Carolina. He enlisted in 1861. He was promoted sergeant by December 62, elected lieutenant 1863, and he's buried in Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston, South Carolina. So his body was recovered, along with Private William Calvin Butler, Company E of the 3rd South Carolina, same company. He's the young man with the beard laying next to Captain Langford. He was an interesting man. He was about 20 years old, remembered as being witty, very ready, and always very, very kind. He died just right beside his captain. He was age 20 and buried there here on the Rose Farm. The third, probably the saddest, is Private Thomas W. Sly, who lays next to him. Sly was a student at Newberry College when he enlisted in 1861. He was also about 20 years old, and remembering for being just a really happy young man. Happy, get about, everybody liked him. They liked him so much they made him an aide to the colonel. And on July 2nd, 1863, as he's attending to the colonel's horses, he's upset because the regiment's going in without him. The adjutant of the regiment says, Sly, take the horses back. You don't have any word in this. And Sly burst into tears, begging to go in. And the adjutant told him, well, Tom, for this one time you may go in, but don't ever ask it again. Private Sly hurried off with a smile, and that was the last anybody saw of him, until that photo appeared. Thomas Sly, killed here at the Rose Farm, July 2nd, 1863, and buried here at the end of the Rose Barn. The other photo that surfaced maybe about 20 years ago, now Scott, something like that? Yeah. Which may be familiar to most of you, is this particular one. Dead of a South Carolina regiment laid out for burial. There's a white fence in the background. It's actually a stereo view that I think is being passed around. We've been able to identify exactly where this photo was taken thanks to some research by Scott and several others. That photo was taken right over there, right behind you. The lane was lined on both sides with wood board fence, white wood board fence. It came to a peak down here in front of the bank that went up to the barn. It then cut off to the left, right about the edge of that wheat field, to a large tulip tree which stood right there. And Scott pointed out a couple of things in examining this photograph, is that that tree in the background is indeed that tulip tree which appears in an 1880s photograph of the farm. So those 4 dead are buried right by that tulip tree laid out for burial. And anybody who's examined that also compared to the claim files. It says Mr. Rose claimed he lost paneling. Well, the headboards are made of that paneling, very wide boards. And thanks to the research of Greg Coco and several others, and especially Scott, we know exactly who these 4 men are. all from Company I, the Palmetto Guard, the 2nd South Carolina Infantry, and killed on July 2nd. Left to right, Private Thomas Gaston, Private Septimus Miles, the First Lieutenant William L. Daniel, and Private Edmund James Mills. Gaston was gut shot in the abdomen, lingered at Rose's barn until the next morning, July 3rd, when he died that morning. He was 22 years old. His sister, he wrote his sister on June 15th, at the opening of the campaign. There are various conjectures as to where we're going, and the truth is Lee's plans are too deep for any of us to fathom. He mentioned traveling light, throwing away everything, just basically eating apples and corn, whatever they get their hands on. But he goes on to say that if anything like the march into Maryland last summer, we won't even need a haversack. We lived upon apples and green corn, and the Yankees will run away from us. Unfortunately, on July 2nd, his captain was near his side. He said, I saw the ball hit him. He was fighting by my side as coolly and bravely as usual, and was carried away and died here in the Rose Barn. And there he lays in that photograph. Private Septimus Sept Mills. Sepp was his nickname. He was also known as the life of the company, and there's no one to supply his place. 25 years old, he's buried in Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston. He enlisted May 2nd, mustered in the Palmetto Guard on May 22nd, 1861. The captain, Elliot, wrote his family after soon he had passed away about his death here at Gettysburg, and added, I had a headboard prepared with his name and company marker placed on his body, but before the implements could be procured to dig the grave, a whole line was ordered to retire, and his body was left in the hands of the enemy. The problem wasn't marking the bodies, it was having the implements, the tools, the spades, the shovels, the picks, to be able to bury all these guys. Next was Private Edmund James Mills, who's 21 years old. His personal effects consisted of $110 Confederate money that was sent to his father. He's also buried at Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston. He was known as a gallant soldier, quiet and unassuming, high-minded, conscientious, entirely free from all vices to which soldiers are addicted. I can't imagine the vices. The last and most intriguing has got to be Lieutenant Daniel. He was a very intelligent man. He was a doctor, a physician before the war, and he chose to go off and serve as an infantryman, not as a surgeon, but as an infantryman in the Palmetto Guard, 2nd South Carolina. Lieutenant William Lowndes Daniel. His personal effects were recovered, sent to his father William after the battle. He was born in 1833 and was about 31 years old at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. Enlisted in Charleston, mortally wounded. He was taken here to the Rose Barn, where he was cared for and died later that evening or early the next morning. As one soldier wrote, no more generous or gallant spirit has been sacrificed on our country's altar since the beginning of the war than that of the brave Daniel. His captain, in a letter to his father, writes, your son, I believe, died a Christian. He said he was prepared to meet his Maker and was conscious until within a few moments of his last. His last dying request to a wounded comrade in arms was, inform my father, I died doing my duty and I am prepared to die. Indeed, he was a very much of a baptized Christian and held that faith all to the very, very end. And Scott sent me an account not too long ago of a chance encounter years after the war. I believe it was his nephew that encountered a former comrade of Daniel who'd been wounded here at Gettysburg. The man's name was Corporal Charles Colcock, who was a 4th Corporal, I think, in Company I. And he was with Daniel in his dying moments and told him that possibly he was spared long enough. Thankfully, Daniel said he was spared long enough to prepare for the great beyond, whereupon Uncle William actually smiled and said that was all arranged long ago, and then he passed away. Lieutenant Daniel was buried here in the yard by his comrades, and his body later recovered. The twist of this is his brother, James Madison Daniel, who was in Company E of the 7th South Carolina and fought just where we were a little while ago, was also killed here. He was taken back to the Pitzer Schoolhouse where he was buried. The family was absolutely devastated, as you can imagine. They lost both sons here at Gettysburg. And in 1868, about a year after his wife died, their father came here to Gettysburg, got in touch with Dr. J.W.C. O'Neill, found both bodies, and returned them to South Carolina for burial. I promise it's the last picture. And this is where I have to thank Scott for providing this photograph. This is a very early image of Lieutenant Daniel, the way he looked in 1859 or 1860, I believe.
Yeah.
Very young man, very handsome. Not the bloated corpse you see in that one image by the fence there here on the Rose Farm. And maybe that's the way we should remember him and all the soldiers who fought here. He'd be in the blue with the gray. They were young men with hopes and dreams. They were fighting for a reason, fighting for a cause. Many of them, at least 600 of them, met their end here on the George Rose Farm. And this ground has never been the same since. I want to thank you. We're way over time. I know you guys got to get some lunch. Refresh yourselves. It's been a great group. Thanks for coming on this tour.